A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 14. And God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. The word of the Lord.
So if you've been with us, we've been going through the Ten Commandments as we've been tracking through the Israelites' journey out of freedom, out of slavery into freedom as they journey through the wilderness. And we've been looking at every single one of the Ten Commandments week by week, and now we're at the seventh commandment. And so we've been sort of also doing our reading in sort of a cumulative way, not only to remind you of what's kind of come before, but also to remind you that this is the way that when God first starts, it says, I've already saved you. You're already in a relationship with me, and now here's how I want you to live for you to most flourish. And that's the context of the Ten Commandments. And so we've been saying that the Ten Commandments are really the law of love that helps us to flourish most, to live what it means to be truly human. And today we get to this seventh commandment because you can't talk about how to flourish or what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to behave, not only with God and but with other people, without talking about intimacy and relationships. So the seventh commandment talks about not committing adultery in marriage, but more broadly, what it's getting at is about sex, marriage, singleness, everything connected to that altogether. Because if we want to actually understand why it is wrong to commit adultery in a marriage, we first have to actually see what God says in general about sex. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I don't know if you knew you were going to enter into that, but that is the topic of today. If you're new or you're visiting, you have known nothing about Christianity, hopefully after this, you will know more. No other promises beyond that. And I think it's really important that we do talk about it because I would say most people don't really have a full understanding of what the Bible or what Christianity says about something as prevalent and important to us as sex. You know, and if you're anything like me growing up, I always sort of thought it was just restrictive. It was just a joy kill, and Christians were the prudes, right? And of course, as you're growing up, that's not the way that you want to live. That's not how culture instructs us to live. At the same time, in the relationship to the church hasn't helped create sort of this holistic understanding of sex either. Because in the history of the church, we've done a poor job. We've overemphasized sort of sexual sin over and above other kinds of things. And so we in the church, we make it feel especially bad or especially dirty or especially shameful. And people don't realize that the Bible talks way more about greed than Jesus ever does talk about sex. And then, of course, the context that we're all living in is that we live in a culture that is hyper-sexualized. Hyper-sexualized. Just open up your phone, open up Instagram or anything, right? And watch anything on Netflix, and it is hypersexualized. So all that to say, I don't think we really know what we're supposed to think about sex, right? And especially, I don't think we have a proper view that's intended by God through Scripture. And I think you might be surprised to find that God actually says, sex is very, very good. He's like, I made it, I invented it for you to enjoy. Sex is something that's meant to be life-giving, and it is very, very beautiful. And it is meant for the flourishing of humanity. But because God is the one who created it, if we do not interact with it with his specific purposes in mind, it won't be fulfilling. It won't be joyful. It won't be the kind of life-giving thing that God has always meant for us to have. You know, it's sort of like the rest of the Ten Commandments, right? We've been saying that these are sort of boundaries for our good, right? For our flourishing. That's what it's meant for. And it's the same with this particular commandment. And I think you might be surprised to even hear that some of our best cultural values around sex, relationships, dating, actually comes from a Christian worldview. Today we love the idea of having consent, right? Valuing another person instead of abusing them. Well, that is a distinctly Christian idea that came to form modern values. Or we like to think that our sexuality and our bodies are very important. Christianity also came and affirmed the goodness and had a very high view of what the body was for, what our sexuality was for. See, the story of Scripture in the Bible about these things is to not look down on it, but to give us an even more higher view, more holistic view of what God intends with something very central to us like sexuality. But in order for us to understand it, we're going to have to see sex connected to a much greater story than what we typically believe if we want to see what God intends for it. So I want to spend some time looking at the different kinds of stories that we believe about sex and what God might have to say about it, and to be open to being pleasantly surprised at how beautiful and how radically different his vision is for it that might give us a lot more life than we expect. But therefore, I want to start first with what are some of our modern conceptions or modern stories about sex that we tend to live in. I think there's a stream of view that says, hey, it's really just not a big deal, right? Stop talking so much about it. It's just a physical thing that everybody has urges to want to participate in. Just like you get hungry physically, you get sexual arousal. That's something that is inherent to just our physical appetites. And so there's a stream of thought that says just do it whenever, with whoever, as long as it's consensual. That really boils down a view of sex of saying, this is really just for pleasure, and it has a very low view of everything else that's happening within that sexual context. Now, at the same time, our culture today doesn't just have a low view of sex within our bodies, it has a very, very high view as well. Because expressing our sexuality is one of the main ways that modern culture gets an identity, right? The modern narrative as to who you are and what you're supposed to be really comes from this idea that you're supposed to look within yourself, and whatever feelings or expressions that you feel there, you have to express it outwardly, because that's what it means to, live into an identity. And sexuality is one of the main ways that our culture tells us that you are to express yourself, that you are supposed to define your identity. Right? It means that you are to, it's one of the reasons why we hate putting any kind of restrictions around our sexuality, because it feels oppressive. It feels like you are repressing something within you, when instead we want to live into a narrative that says we want to be maximally free to express anything and everything that we find within ourselves. So any kind of restriction around our bodies and sexuality feels like it's oppressive rather than liberating. And all these sort of streams of thoughts are floating around in our cultural narratives, but at the end of the day, I want to contend with us that if those are our views, ultimately, sex is something that is self-serving. It is all about actualizing ourselves, right? It is all about our independence and what we do, and it doesn't really have a sense of interdependence with somebody else, which is why it leads to a view of relationships in general today in modern life, that relationships are for my benefit, not for the sake of somebody else. That as long as this relationship makes me happy and helps me feel fulfilled, then I will stay. But if it doesn't, then I will go. We have a very transactional, contractual kind of a view when it comes to relationships because of our view of sex. Now you might say, well, what's wrong with that? We're not hurting anybody, right? What's wrong if sex is only for my benefit, if it's self-serving? Well, who cares? Well, the truth of the matter is that if that is your view, you will be harming other people. You'll have a view that will want to use and abuse other folks, even though you might not think it. And in the process, you might be harming yourself. I think an easier way to think about sort of these cultural narratives and how it might be harmful is to see how today's modern cultural narratives around sex is very similar to the ancient first century Roman view of sex. Right? So back then there was this Platonic view. Plato sort of said that the spiritual things matter and your physical body doesn't matter. And so, people sort of thought, oh, whatever you do with your body, who cares, right? So do whatever with your body, sort of a low view of sex. But also, much like today, in first century Rome, sex was all about social status. Your sexuality was status-based, which meant the act of sex was something that only reinforced the social hierarchy that people lived in. So here's what I mean by that. So if you were a Roman citizen, an elite free man, you had way more latitude sexually to do with whatever you wanted, right? So you could have sex not only with your wife, but you could have it with a prostitute, and nothing wrong, nothing bad would happen to you. You could have sex with somebody who was a slave or had less rights than you, and also elite free men could have sex with little boys. That's Roman culture. If you were an elite free woman, right, you were a little bit more restricted. You couldn't be that sexually permissive. You had to be faithful to your husband. And so as the man could go out and do whatever he wanted, the wife had to stay chaste and had to be faithful to her husband. And so therefore, sex was only used to reinforce the social hierarchy. And so when we hear that, you think, well, there's a ton of things that's wrong with that. I wouldn't agree with that. That's terrible. That's wrong. But that's the thing. It shows us and reminds us that sex is not a completely private matter, that there is a social harm based on how we view what we do with even our individual bodies, so long as it pertains and act with somebody else. And I want us to see that both of those stories, right, or both of those ideas, whether it's ancient Rome or modern, New York City, both of those ideas are flowing from a greater story as to what you believe about your body and what your sexuality is for. And a lot of times we're just not conscious of that. And to that, Christianity came knocking through the door in the first century with a radically different sexual ethic. Right? When Jesus comes in the New Testament, and then the disciples start to live into what the church is meant to be, it introduced an entirely new story around sex that was category defining. See, the Bible had always taught that sex is not for just your personal self-happiness or for your own personal fulfillment. But the Bible from beginning to end taught that sex was for a whole life-giving act to somebody else, which is a radical, radical thought, which is why throughout all of history, Christianity has unequivocally taught that that sex was designed by God to be between one man and one woman in the context of marriage. Throughout all the history, the Bible's taught that it is meant to be a monogamous, heterosexual, covenanted relationship because again, those are very different ideas than what we have about today, but that's because it was pointing to a greater story, and I want us to sort of become alive to why the logic was for this kind of sexual ethic. Because the idea from a Christian standpoint was that your bodies are saying way more about the rest of your lives, right? Or another way to say it is, what you did with your body was to commit to somebody that you were committing to in every other area of your life. So it was a way to say, I belong completely and exclusively to you in every single aspect. Right? That's what that sexual union was meant to represent. We get this when you look at sort of the first marriage in all of history, back in Genesis chapter 2, when Adam and Eve get married, so God institutes marriage, and Adam sees Eve and he says, oh my gosh, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then we read that the two they shall leave their mother and father and will cleave to one another, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the biblical understanding of what is happening in this sex union in marriage. That of course there is a physical coming together, but when the Bible says that they are now to become one flesh, it is much more holistic than that. It was a way of saying that we're not just united physically, but spiritually, emotionally, personally, economically, financially, legally. We are coming together in every way possible. And so therefore, The reason why Christianity is always taught that sex is only in the context of that kind of marriage is because it's saying, don't say with your body, don't unite with your body what you're not willing to unite in every area of your life. Don't make a commitment in one area and say, I'm going to hold back all these other areas from you. That's why this concept kind of came about. But it's actually even more than that. It's not just the idea that the Bible teaches that the two become one flesh. But even greater than that, the Bible has always taught that sex and marriage is meant to reflect God's divine love toward us. That sex is actually a picture of the gospel, of how God relates and loves us. You know, throughout Scripture, we read that God often relates to his people, even Israel back in the Old Testament, as his bride. He says, you are my bride, I love you. You know, we were just reading the beginning of the Ten Commandments. He's saying, you shall have no other gods before me. He's using exclusive covenant language. He's saying, you are mine. I relate to you in this kind of exclusive way. And therefore, the Bible teaches, especially in places like Ephesians 5, teaches that sex is meant to be a foretaste of our ultimate union with God, where we will know him completely, fully, deeply, where there will be deep delight and intimacy and joy for all of eternity. Like that is where history is moving, where God is moving us to be with him in such a life-giving, intimate way that can only be analogous to sexual pleasure here on earth between a married couple. And so it's meant to be a pattern after this divine love and a spiritual union that we now have with Christ, who gives himself wholly, gives himself completely and exclusively to us. That he is so committed to us in this kind of a way, to his bride, the church. And that's also why it was important to show that there are two different genders coming together in a complementary way to bring about new life. Because it foreshadows the coming together of God and man, of heaven and earth, to bring about more life. And so all that to say, there is a greater picture of what's happening in the sexual union between a man and a woman in the context of marriage. That there is a greater story that's happening about our bodies, a greater story about ourselves even, because it's meant to show to the world God's selfless, committed love to his people. That is why it was always critical that the church and the Bible taught that sex is to be within a marriage context where the fullness of that intimacy and knowing is within the context of the fullness of commitment and utter exclusive love to that person. And so within a marriage context, therefore, sex is meant to be a covenant renewal. It is to say to the other person, say to your spouse, I'm completely yours. There's nothing I'm holding back from you. I'm utterly vulnerable before you and you before me. We're not taking from each other, but we're giving to each other. I am yours and you are mine, and we are one flesh. That is why any kind of sex outside of that marriage context was forbidden by God. That is why adultery becomes forbidden, because it's a breaking of that covenant relationship, and it is distorting the picture that God has intended for us to live into, to show to the world this beautiful, committed kind of love. Now, I get it. There are lots of thoughts that are probably flying around in all of our heads, right? And this is a very different view from what culture says. You know, we tend to think, though, that culture has this very pro-sex view, whereas Christianity has this anti-sex view. But I actually want us to see that the Bible has just a much higher, much more holistic view around sex in our bodies. Because Christianity actually says your bodies and your sexuality are very, very important. It's not just an appetite that you are to satisfy. That it's not just to manipulate body parts in order to use people to get pleasure for yourself. Right? So it says it's a much higher view than that. But also, Christianity teaches, but you also don't idolize sex and marriage. Because as we just learned, it's not the place to find your identity in your romantic partner or your sexual life or sexual fulfillment. But those things are all penultimate to the ultimate relationship that we are brought into with Jesus himself, our ultimate union with him. That's just a radically different, and I would argue, a much more comprehensive and beautiful view of our sexuality and sex than ancient Rome, as well as our modern culture today. And in fact, folks don't know this typically, but Christianity came into the Roman culture and actually created the first sexual revolution. Right? Think about just how sexually promiscuous Roman culture was. Think about how much it was abusing people, especially vulnerable people, right? That didn't have a lot of sexual dignity everywhere. And then Christianity came in and said, no, you can't act like that anymore. You can't look at people that way. There's a greater story around sex. And this first sexual revolution really changed Roman society. It universalized sexual dignity for every single person, which was not the common narrative then. It created a moral responsibility, and the idea of consent or valuing another person came from this Christian sex ethic. There are no longer double standards between men and women, that I don't care what your status is as a free man or not. You are now held to the same standard as everybody else. That's what Christianity came in and said. And it changed culture. It changed the Roman Empire. And a lot of our current cultural views of sex and relating, some of the good parts, come from that very time. And all of that was because it was a gospel story around it that said sex is no longer an act of self-getting, but it was an act of self-giving. This is not a way for you to enhance your power or your status or to gain an identity or personal fulfillment. But Christianity now taught that there was a mutual giving up of power to one another in love, as Christ did for us. It's a very different, beautiful story. And therefore, the Bible taught that your ultimate fulfillment, the thing that you are looking for, is found in this kind of intimacy through this kind of commitment, because it points to what Jesus has done for him in the church, for us in the church. And I say that, and I think a lot of it sort of rings true to us, and I think that's because we have these intuitions that are baked into the moral fabric of our lives. And of course, the Ten Commandments, because it's moral law and it's true in all times and all places, it's sort of getting to the way that the universe works, and it also is getting to the way that our human, personalities also work. Like God knows what He's doing, which is why He bakes this into the fabric of our hearts and into our world. And I think that's becoming more and more prevalent today. That this kind of idea that intimacy and commitment should go together and that should not be decoupled comes more and more now into our mainstream narratives that I think might be helpful for us to understand what the Bible is really trying to get at. And one of the folks that I think that does a really good job of explaining this is this clinical psychologist and counselor. His name is John Van Epp. And I recommend this book. He wrote this book called How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk. Right? How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk. And he mentions jerks are not just men. They're jerkettes. It's gender neutral. Women can be jerks as well. And he pioneers this idea of the relationship attachment model after lots of clinical research and scientific research that gets to this biblical idea that deep intimacy is meant for the context only in a deep commitment. And he says this, I know the quote is up here, I'll read it in a second, but he says basically this in his book, that the modern love idea that we live out today, that essentially prioritizes romance and attraction. That's how we get married. That's a very modern conception, and that's not how it used to be done in the past. Obviously, think about arranged marriages and things like that. But therefore, because now our emotions and our attraction is at the forefront, we are at much higher risk now of letting our emotions play a much greater role rather than duty or community like it was in the past. And when our emotions get into the way, what can happen is that it can start to switch off your brain until it's too late. And that is what he says. That's how you can fall in love with a jerk, how you can miss all the early warning signs, right? Because our emotions are in the way. And here's this quote from Van Epp. He says this: the initial and overwhelming feelings of closeness and connection cloak the problems that will eventually become a problem. And you become infected with the love is blind syndrome. So he says, love is blind is not just a thing. It's a real thing that can happen to us, especially when our emotions get in the way. And in the book, he talks about how one of the common ways that we will tend to fall in love with a jerk is that we accelerate the pace of a relationship. That there are these 5 fundamental dynamics of bonding like bonding of attachment that's meant to go building block by block, building on top of one another that leads to a very healthy kind of a relationship. And so therefore, he calls this the relationship attachment model. We can put it up on the screen. But he says these 5 things have to happen in order without one outpacing the other. This is how you grow into a healthy, life-giving relationship, a good kind of bond with one another. You first start with knowing the person. Makes total sense. You got to know the person before you can fall in love with them. And the way that you know someone is through 3 things. You have to have talk, right? Mutual self-disclosure. You have to find out about one another. This is like this is now like when you're texting with someone before you actually go out for coffee, probably, if you're swiping left or right. I don't know which way it is. First is talk, and through that is mutual self-disclosure. It's also through togetherness. So you have to have diversified experiences with that person, with that other person. You have to see them in the context of their friends, during fun things, during hard things, during leisurely things, right? You have diversity of experiences. And then it has to come through time. So talk, togetherness, and time. And throughout that, you have to really be yourself. You have to have a mutual self-disclosure. You can't hide from one another. And he says those things have to happen over time because you can't escape time. You can fool somebody for a little bit, but over a longer period of time, you really start to feel you know them. Think about your closest friends who know you really, really well. You spend a lot of time with them. You've had experiences with them, and you feel like, therefore, you know who they are. And that's what leads to the second thing. Therefore, that's the thing that leads to trust. Trust is believing about that. It's like what you believe about that person based on their character and their consistency. This is your internal conclusion about this other person. And so if you just meet somebody on the street, especially here in New York, you're not going to trust them at all because you don't have time, togetherness, or talk. But after a long period of time, you start to trust them. But here's the thing. If trust outpaces knowing, right? So you trust them before you really know, what can happen is you will either idealize a person or project onto that person. And so you start to become infatuated with an idea of someone rather than someone themselves. That's one of the first things that can lead to having a harmful relationship. So you have to build trust after you know. And then from there, what happens is you start to grow in reliance on the other person. You start to depend on them for emotional and spiritual, physical things. So it's not just an independence that happens, but an interdependence that starts to form, right? Obviously, think about it. It's hard to rely on someone without first trusting that they're going to be there, without knowing their character or their consistency. But he says that if reliance on someone outpaces trust, how much you trust them, it can create a really unhealthy bonding and an unhealthy kind of dependence on the other person. And again, that can lead us to ignore early warning signs. And then only after that can you start to commit to another person. Right? Those other steps are necessary for you to finally commit and now define this relationship. And this is a way of growing in intimacy with them and saying, hey, I'm not just going to run away from you. Let's define what this is. Let's show up for one another, and let's figure out a way that we're going to be committed to one another. And he says that serious commitment always has to be the fruit of all of the 3 previous things, of knowing, trusting, and relying. Otherwise, you make a commitment too early and you feel trapped. And then he says this, finally, after those areas, then touch enters into a relationship. Only after degrees of that do you move into that, because touch, he says, has a very strong bonding to it. There's an attachment effect that happens. And therefore, a level of physical touch turns up the emotional volume of the 4 other categories, because it's meant to reinforce those things in a relationship. Right? I'm sure things are running through your minds and sort of seeing the truth or the falseness maybe of this. We can talk about it after. But this is sort of what he, in his studies, has said, this is the path toward proper healthy attachment to somebody. And you can imagine this sort of going in mini cycles over and over again, right? Until you feel safe to break the physical barrier in lots of other areas, right? And when some of these things are out of order, you instantly feel intuitively like, that we weren't ready for that. That was weird. Like, have you ever been out with somebody and you're just getting to know them and they try to hold your hand and you're like, oh, that's weird. We're not hand-holding types right now. why is that? It's because something has gone out of order, or someone feels like they're closer to you than what you actually can physically, than you're emotionally ready to be at. And I think this, and we can put the chart down, but I think this makes sense to us intuitively, right? This sort of, you're like, okay, I'm tracking with that. That makes a lot of sense. But here's what he says. He says that when sex enters into a relationship, it always intensifies your experience of closeness, which is why he says one of the key rules for not falling in love with a jerk and to have a healthy and safe relationship is to never go further in one bonding area than you have gone in the previous one. Otherwise, you start becoming overly attached and you start overlooking a lot of different things. I think what I love about this concept, again, it's not necessarily a Christian concept, though I think he might have a Christian background. It shows that the greater the intimacy that is involved, the greater greater the amount of physical attraction, the physical touch that you want in that area, has to rightly come in the context of a matching level of commitment, which is completely in line with what the Bible says and what it teaches about sex being in the covenant of marriage. Right? Sex is the ultimate form of physical touch. And therefore, in this earthly world, marriage, a covenant marriage that's unbreakable, is the ultimate promise and the commitment that you can make here on earth. Right? And so you can imagine those things going really, really well when we get to know them and you trust them and you rely on them, you commit to them, and then you hold hands. But what have we done in this world today? We flipped the order. We start with touch, and we hope to God that we can trust this person. And we realize, I don't even know this person. And what he says is that can lead to an uneasiness in relationships. It leads to a lot of vulnerability, because when sex enters into that without that shared level of commitment to one another, the partner always feels unsure of themselves, whether they can be trusted. And it can lead to a lot of emotional, unsafe relationships. And biblically, what we'd essentially be saying is what you're doing there is you're saying, the other person is saying to you, I want more from you than what I'm willing to give to you. Or I've given you more, and now I want more from you, but I'm not having that from you because we don't have a level of commitment. See, culture is telling us that you have to decouple intimacy from commitment. Don't have a great high view of sex. Do it whenever you want. Use it for yourself. Build your own identity off of it. But when we do, we realize that that's never the path toward true fulfillment. I mean, our hearts deeply desire to be known and to be intimate with another person. Of course we do. But that's because we're made to be in that kind of a relationship with God himself. And we're looking for that in all these other different kinds of places. And when we do it poorly outside of God's command, it can lead to harming ourselves or a lot of confusion. Or also harming other people. And that's the thing, God knows that. God is like, sex and relationships and marriage, that's all my idea. I gave you these things, and I have a great purpose in mind for it. And he's telling us through these commandments that he's saying, I've got a better story for you to live into that shows the world how to better relate to yourself and to other people. And the best part about this story is that every single person is invited into this kind of relationship, regardless of your marital status or your sexual orientation or your dating life. Because here's the thing that the Bible teaches, is that Jesus doesn't just show us a pattern of love that we are now to follow. But what he shows us is that we are all recipients of this kind of redemptive love. You know, the 10 Commandments, it's God saying, this is how I want you to relate to me, because you are mine. You are in covenant relationship with me. I've made an exclusive promise to you. I'm giving myself completely to you in intimacy. That's what this covenant relationship is all about. And the love that God loves us with is not a transactional love. It is not a selfish kind of love. But instead, the crazy thing is that he says, I'm going to seek to be holistically united to you. A people who have been unfaithful, a people who've been disobedient, a people who've not loved me back or loved me well at all, a people who've committed adultery against me. And yet God says, I'm still going to relate to you. I'm still going to give you the love that your heart desires, that you're looking for in any other romantic relationship in this world. And I'm going to relate to you by sending you my very son, so that you would be the recipient of my divine, redemptive love over you. And friends, when you see how Jesus loves us, you see that he is the only one that we can fully and completely trust in a relationship to give us what we're desiring. Jesus says, I've come to not only know you, but I know everything about you. I know all of your deepest flaws. I know everything that you've done wrong, and yet I will still move toward you. Yet I will still rely and I will still commit to you. And he says, I want you to know everything about me. And when you discover me, you will see that I am so dependable, that I am so trustworthy, that I can handle your heart, that I can fulfill everything that you're looking for. And even though we were not suited to be a recipient of that kind of a love, he says, I'm going to come and I'm going to commit to you, even though you feel that you're not worth it. Commit to you with a love that says, I'm going to lay down my life for your sake. That is how committed I am to you. Even though you should be receiving judgment for the ways in which you have disobeyed, for the ways in which you've not lived into my law, I'm going to die the death that you deserve to show you a love on the cross that says you are more loved than you could ever imagine. And he says all of that is going to point to our future holistic union. That sex is meant to be just a foretaste of our complete oneness with Jesus himself, our perfect bridegroom for all of eternity. And that all of the intimacy, all of the ecstasy, all of the pleasure, and the freedom of being completely known and completely loved, we are all going to have with him. No matter what your current status might be or what your hopes might be, even if you're in a great marriage or a painful marriage, whether you're single and hoping to get married or whatever your background might be, Jesus says this is the kind of love that you have right now. And this love will never leave you, and this is the only love that will ever fulfill you. And he says once you experience this kind of love, then we can go out and show the world another kind of way to engage, another way, a better story about how we relate to one another, how we use our bodies, what we think about sex, to bring hope in places of a lot of brokenness that we experience. And then finally, Jesus says this. He says, and I didn't just come to do it just for you personally. He says, the recipient of my love is not just you. It is the church. It is this new spiritual family that I've brought back together. And to be a part of God's spiritual family is now to have a foretaste of the future in which all of humanity's relationships will be healed. Every brokenness will be mended. Every desire and yearning will be fulfilled. That is what you're brought into. That is what you get to live out now, whether it's through your marriage or whether it's through your singleness. And he now gives us a new mission to go out, not to find a partner for self-fulfillment, but whatever our status might be, that we now are meant to be a beautiful signpost of Jesus' love for his bride, his love for us, his love for the church, and hopefully his love for our neighbors, our love for Brooklyn, love for this world, a love that he came to spread with a different story that can change everything.